Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, it is a live talk, but it's about the dead. So I guess we're going to bring the opposites together for a bit this afternoon. And I'm surprised such a good turnout on Mother's Day. I won't ask the reasons why. But here we are. Yes, Carl Jung and the dead. Well, what I hope to show this afternoon is that Jung had actually a fascination with the dead throughout his entire life and career, both in a very literal sense, corpses and things of that sort, but then also the afterlife and everything to do with it. And there's a picture of Carl over there in his library, a Kusnak. I don't know if you can make out the Gnostic ring that's on one of his fingers on his hand there, but that's the family plot in the churchyard in Kusnak in Switzerland, and you can see going back to Carl's his father Johannes, and making out his mother's there, his sister, his wife, Carl himself, and at the very bottom, I think it's one of his. It might be one of his sons, or one of his daughters. I can't see it right now. And over here in the same churchyard is the shared plot of Barbara Hanna and Marie-Louise von Franz, who were two very, very important followers, exponents of Jung's work. And if I manage to get through all my slides at the end, there'll be a slide of a book about dreams and death that von Franz wrote. Barbara Hanna did quite a lot. Both of them wrote biographies of Jung. Both knew Jung for many, many years. And Barbara Hanna also wrote quite a bit about active imagination, this strange technique that Jung developed, having a kind of conscious dialogue with the unconscious. And just to get this out of the way, here's an unabashed self-promotion. Most of the stuff we'll be talking about this afternoon, comes from my book, Jung the Mystic. I originally wanted a question mark at the end of that, but the publisher thought that would inhibit sales. So we don't have that. But you can see, there's a quote from the Washington Post and Philip Pullman. But the one I like the most is, anyone who believes I'm a mystic is an idiot. That would have meant quite a few people at the time. And as I say in the book, and I won't go into it right this afternoon, Jung himself could be included in that category, because he did not claim outright to be a mystic. He said he was not. But if you, as I say in the beginning of the book, he basically says mystics are people who have an experience of the collective unconscious, of the archetypes, direct, unmediated. And Jung himself claimed to have had such experiences. So by his own definition, of someone who had direct, immediate experience of the collective unconscious and the archetypes, he would have been a mystic as well. So Jung has a very convoluted, circular way of doing things, and he often says things, and he gives you three definitions about something and all that. And that makes for a happy hunting ground, a lot of good fishing. You can find a lot of stuff in there. He's not as clear as Freud was, but he left a lot for people to uncover. And probably the most important, let's say, or striking, life-changing experience Jung had with the dead was his own near-death experience. It happened in February of 1944, during the war years. Switzerland was neutral, but it was still caught up in all the problems. It was privations and things of that sort. Jung was walking, and it was icy, and he slipped, fell, and broke his leg. And then while he was in hospital, he had a heart attack because of an embolism in the immobile leg. And throughout the heart attack, or the aftermath of it, he found himself floating up above the earth, thousands of miles out in space. And in fact, Jung gave a description of the Earth seen from space well in advance of the first shots that we got from any of the Apollo programs or the NASA, stuff like that. So all the pictures we're familiar of the Earth, and the clouds and the water and all that sort of thing, Jung, he didn't draw it, didn't have an actual photograph, but his description. So he says, and this is in his posthumous autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. He says that he could see the snow-capped Himalayas and the sandy wastes of the Arabian desert, things of that sort. And he was quite happy to be leaving all that behind. And he was floating out of the Earth's orbit, and he saw first sort of a monolith. So if you think something like, that black block in 2001, the Kubrick film. He saw something like that. And then he said he saw a floating Hindu temple. I couldn't find a floating one, but that's the closest I could find. And he said there were all candles lit in all these niches in the temple. And in the front of the temple was a Hindu sitting in a yogi position. And Jung was sort of slowly moving towards the temple. And he knew that once he entered it, everyone in his life who had been important to him, who had died, would be there. And then the mystery, the meaning, the purpose of his own life would be revealed to him. And as he approached closer and closer, he suddenly realized or saw somehow below him, coming up from Earth, was the figure of his doctor. But it wasn't his doctor in his normal, white smock and, that thing that has the mirror up there and all that kind of, but with the stethoscope. It was doctor in the archetypal form of the king of Kos, who, Kos was the island in Greece that was sort of the home of the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius. And there's Asclepius there, and there's the serpent. That's associated, pharmacies, chemists, you see the serpent. And it's also associated with Hermetism, so there's a strange overlapping. Asclepius is one of the figures in the Corpus Hermeticum. That's a tangential thing, but there is this overlapping between medicine and Hermetic philosophy. But Jung saw his doctor floating up from the planet, and he was trying to get to that temple before he got to him. But he came up and he said, no, Carl, sorry, can't go, you got to go back. Too many people there complaining, they won't let you go. Most of them are women, and they just won't let you go. And I have to bring you back. And Jung was like, he wasn't happy. He says that he had shed all of the earthly, petty, trivial stuff that we're occupied with most of our lives, and he was quite prepared to enter, go into the next realm and all of that. But good doctor, responsible, conscientious person that he was, he followed the doctor's advice and went back with him. But he was concerned that because the doctor had come to him and brought him back from the edge, that he had sacrificed his own life for Jung's. And especially because the doctor arrived in the archetypal form of the king of Kos, the ruler of the land that Asclepius came from. And Jung, during this whole time, along with all this, he was, from the nurses and the doctors, he was in delirium from him. He was in the midst of this incredible mystical experience. And he saw this Swiss nurse, he saw her as an old Jewish woman, and she was involved in this mystical marriage of the tree of life, between Tifereth, which is the center of the tree of life, if you know your Kabbalah, and Malkuth, which is the earthly realm we're here now. And a variety of other things like that. And obviously the doctors around him just thought he was, off his nut. He was he was delirious. But he was going on and on about this. But he was really concerned that something would happen to his doctor. And sure enough, on April 4th, 1944, which is a date that numerologists could delight in, I suspect, this was the first day that Jung sat up in bed after his heart attack. And on that day, his doctor came down with septicemia, and he died a few days later. So Jung felt that his doctor had sacrificed his life to bring Jung back. And earlier than his own near-death experience, when his sister Gertrude died, she was one of the names on the family plot, the stone there, he said that the events around her death convinced him that what happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it. So Jung's own experience, and he doesn't go into great detail talking about his sister's death, but something must have happened around her that brought him to that conclusion. And it's rather like reports of NDEs that we hear, from other sources, and much like the, very well-known one of Ibn Alexander's Proof of Heaven. So somehow Jung had, very immediate, for him, incontrovertible, knowledge and experience of a true afterlife. This is something that, it's there. He basically says it's true and it's there. Although, as I tried to make clear in my book, Jung played these sorts of cards very close to his chest for most of his career. It was only after his own near-death experience, after his heart attack, that he kind of came out of the occult closet, as it were. He was always interested in this stuff, and I'm going to show you that. But he was a cagey, very tactful, very prudent individual. And you can say, well, he didn't want to talk about this openly because personally, he didn't want to talk about it openly because he didn't want his reputation as a scientist to be tarnished. So for himself, personally, because throughout his career, he wasn't a mystic, he wasn't an artist. But if you've ever seen any of the images from the Red Book, he is an artist, or he was an artist. But he claimed not to be an artist. He was a scientist, Herr Dr. Professor Jung, of the Bergolzli Klinik, and many, many other places, which when he got his ire up, he would reel off at great length, all the different academic qualifications he had and all that sort of thing. But after the heart attack and after the near-death experience, he kind of loosened up about that. And for the remaining years of his life, I think it was about 17 years, he was very open about a variety of different, what we would call occult interests that he had maintained throughout his life, and anyone around him knew that was the case. But publicly, out in the open, he kind of kept it close to his chest. But it's not surprising that Jung would have had these experiences. Excuse me. Oh, for speaker. Just in case you were wondering if any of you could have this, you can't, apparently so. But I'll make an exception. If anyone is really thirsty, you can please come up and have some. But it ran in his family. I mean, it's a cliche to say it was in his DNA, but it actually was. That's his mother. This is Mother's Day, so here we go. That's Jung's mother, Emily Jung, nie Preiswerk. And that was her father there, Samuel Preiswerk. And when Emily was Samuel Jung grew up in a family of Lutheran Protestant pastors and all that, on both sides, mother and father. He grew up in a deeply religious Protestant environment. And Samuel Preiswerk learned Hebrew because he believed that was the language angels spoke in heaven. And he must have felt fairly confident that he was going to arrive there if he learned the language before you're going. So he had his little Berlitz book, I guess, before he went, and all that. But he believed in the reality of spirits, and at the dinner table he kept an empty seat for his deceased first wife, with whom he would have conversations, much to the consternation of his living second wife, who was at the table as well. And when Emily was a young girl, she was employed by her father Samuel to shoo the spirits away while he was writing his sermons. So if you can imagine Samuel there, and he's got an old quill pen or something, and it's a lectern like this, and he's trying to write his sermons, and Emily is sort of around him going, a variety of things of that sort to shoo the spirits away, because he believed the evil spirits were around him going to bother him and stop him from writing his sermons and all that sort of thing. And Emily herself spoke in tongues. She conducted seances. There's an odd story about her falling into a coma when she was a young girl, or a young woman. That went on like for 72 hours or something like this, and they awoke her. They took very strict measures back then. They woke her by poking a red-hot poker into her forehead. This woke her up. I don't know if you can get that on the NHS now. We're working on it. But there are independent health institutes where you can apply for that particular kind of therapy. And Jung, as a young boy, he would hear his mother. She was usually pretty much bog standard, Swiss Hausfrau most of the time. But every now and then she would slip into another personality, and she would say these gnomic, very, very, deep, kind of cryptic kind of statements, something like that, in a very, very different sort of voice. And Jung himself, when he was a young boy, if you know anything about his childhood, I can't go into it, it's in the book, you can't go into great detail here, but it was not necessarily a dysfunctional family, but it wasn't the best environment to be brought up in and all that kind of thing. So he went through some difficult times when he was a young boy. And he himself started to manifest the second personality. He talks about it in Memory, Dreams, and Reflection. There's like personality number one and personality number two. Personality number one was the Jung, inept, Jung, inept, clumsy. He didn't mix well. He didn't make friends easily. All that sort of thing. And he was just kind of bumbling all the time. And then every now and then he'd be taken over by this other personality. Personality number two, and that was a masterful gentleman of the 18th century, who wore a tri-corner hat and buckled shoes, and had a carriage and all this sort of thing. And Jung later came to believe that this was someone he may have been in a past life. He never uses the word reincarnation, but again, the way he kind of hems and haws and talks about the collective unconscious, and through the collective unconscious we can experience the lives of our ancestors. And so he kind of finds a way into it, but he doesn't use the word reincarnation. He didn't have anything good to say about theosophy, I have to say, folks, nor about anthroposophy. There's a famous story where one of his clients, was also a follower of Rudolf Steiner and gave him some of Steiner's books to read. And after he had, and she asked Jung, what did you think? He said, that man should be in an asylum. So he didn't have much, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like that. So he didn't have much good to say about it. Some of the seances that his mother was involved in also were his cousin here, Helena Preiswerk. Although in his dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called psychic phenomena or paranormal phenomena, I forget exactly, occult phenomena, which is about his taking part in all these seances and his observations and all that sort of thing. He never mentions that it's his cousin. He was 15 years old and he's actually in love with him at the time. But she too, she had inherited the Preiswerk blood. She spoke in tongues, she had visions, she would fall into a trance and become different personalities. She predicted that there were two other sisters in the family who were, one was in Brazil, I forget where the other one was, and she made accurate predictions about births of their children. One would have a stillbirth, and that was the case. One was married to a half-caste, and she said she's going to have a black child, and blah, blah, blah. So all these sorts of things at a time when, there wasn't Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok. It took a while to get the news. Certainly from Brazil to Switzerland, it took a bit of time to get the news. So when she fell into these states, she actually, produced quite a lot of accurate, what we would call paranormal phenomena. But after a while, Jung realized that she was kind of embellishing her accounts because she wanted to keep Jung's interest, because she was in love with him. And we'll get on to it, but for her birthday, Jung gave her a copy of a famous book from the 19th century by Justinus Kerner called The Seeress the Prevorst. And it's about a woman named Friederike Hofer, who was a famous, at the time, psychic. And Helly read this, and she started to basically bring up stuff that was in the book. So she was doing her most to try to keep her cousin Carl interested, and he realized that it wasn't happening. But this fascination with the dead went back even earlier than these seances. When Jung was a young man, and he was starting out in his career as a psychologist. And when he was a boy, he exhibited, and again, this is in his, I didn't ferret this out. This is in his autobiography, written with Eni Eliyafi, who was his amanuensis at the time. But he talks about, he was fascinated with corpses. And there was, I forget, it was when they were living in Basel or somewhere like that, there was a great flood. The river had flooded. And when the waters receded, he saw the bodies. And one of them was dressed in black, as many people are these days. There must be a sociological, historical treatise. I suspect people have done this already, about when everybody started wearing black. I think it started happening in the early 80s, because in the 60s and 70s it was exceptional. But, I mean, in any case, that's tangential. But the reason I mention this is that Jung grew up in this very, very religious family. But one of the polarities he had to deal with was, okay, there was Jesus, but there's two sides of Jesus. There was sweet Jesus, he liked children, he was very gentle, took care of them, come up. It was heaven was like a big Benetton ad or something. Everybody comes up and we're all hugging each other. But then there was the Jesus who took people back to him by burying them in the ground. They went back to Jesus when they died, and they went into a hole in the ground. So this was like, this was the difficult thing for the Jung. I keep saying the Jung. Jung as a boy to assimilate, and then there was another case when a young boy had drowned in the river, and Jung's father allowed the body to be kept in their wash house until whatever the coroner or the doctor, whatever, could get there. And Jung was determined to get into the wash house and look at the corpse. His mother, he insisted on watching a pig being slaughtered once. His mother didn't, tried to keep him away, but he wanted to be in there and watch it. But one of the, I don't know what we might call it, oddest of these sorts of experiences was when his actual father was dying. Paul Jung was a frustrated individual who was a pastor, but he long ago gave up the faith, but he didn't have anything else to do. And Jung was one of these horribly inquisitive children who kept asking questions about religion and God and all this stuff. And his father said, no, you must have faith, trying to shore up his own, lost faith. And they were at loggerheads most of the time. His mother was more or less the dominant kind of character in the family. And that may have something to do with a certain feminine dominance in Jungian psychology in the Jungian world, but I don't know, just throwing that out there. But when his father was dying, he sat near his father. And it's not unusual to sit, if you're there with a close one, a parent or a relative, when they're passing away and you're with them. But he had a clinical approach to it. He actually was just like wanting to sort of, he was a doctor at this time, but he wanted to sort of watch the process of death when it happened, that sort of thing. And then when his father did die, his mother, in voice number 2, said, yes, he died at the right time. Now it was time for him, for Jung to become, the central masculine figure in the family. And he was a young man, and he did. He took on all the responsibilities and all that sort of thing. So, before his mother died, Jung had a dream of this figure in Nordic mythology called the wild huntsman. And the wild huntsman comes out, with the wolf or sometimes the wolf, the horse, whatever, to bring a soul back, to take a soul to the, to the underworld. And I don't know, shortly after having this dream, his mother died. And there's a funny story about his father, who already passed away. And Jung said that dreams about his father can, more than anything else, I guess prior to his own near-death experience, convinced him of, or at least led him to not categorically deny the possibility of an afterlife, the way he would phrase it in some scientific way so as not to be nailed down to actually believing in it. But the funny story is that Jung's father had died already, right? And his mother had passed away. And then Jung dreamed that his father came to him and said, basically, you're a psychologist, your mother's coming here, can you give me some help? We didn't get on in real life, we're going to be here in eternity together. It's like, give me something here. I don't know what Jung told his father. This was a dream, but he may have, in some way tried to communicate something. He may have suggested reading Swedenborg's book on conjugal love, which Swedenborg wrote in his 80s, but he does talk about how in heaven the angels have sexual relationships and things of that sort. Now, Swedenborg was someone who spoke with the dead regularly. He often went on these journeys to heaven and hell, and there's lots of stories about him gaining information from people who had passed on that no one else knew, that no one else would have had this information. And someone else who was a contemporary of Jung's, and I mentioned earlier Jung didn't have much good to say about him, but Steiner spoke with the dead as well. Steiner too had a fascination or a deep relationship, or whatever you want to call it, with the dead. And before he became Rudolf Steiner, the leader of anthroposophy, or prior to that, the leader of the German branch of theosophy, he performed eulogies for two individuals that he didn't know in life, but he was somehow asked to perform a eulogy for them at their death, and he was able to talk about these people as if he'd known them their entire life, and he said that he had communicated with them, in the afterworld and all this sort of thing. And if you ever wondered how you might want to speak with the dead, Steiner said the best way to do this is as you're falling asleep. You ask a question that you would like, to address to the dead, and they will answer you the next morning as you wake up. So it's in that intermediate realm between sleeping and waking, which is known as the hypnagogic state. And Jung, Steiner, and Swedenborg were all well-practiced hypnagogists. They were all very familiar with being able to hover in that in-between state. Active imagination is more or less what that is. When Steiner was reading the Akashic record, that's more or less what he was doing. Physiologically, Metaphysically, ontologically, it's something else, but actually physiologically, what was happening in his body, his brain, that was what was going on. And when Swedenborg was going on his journeys to heaven, hell, other planets, the spirit world, something like that. Apparently, there's reports that Swedenborg was able to stay in that state for like hours on end. So it's a deeply meditative state, and we know in Tibetan Buddhism there's this dream yoga state as well. But one of the things also that Jung, Swedenborg, and Steiner all basically said too is that the dead need us to help them. That was the Jungian slip just then. The dead need us to help them. They need us to help them fulfill stuff that they weren't able to do in their own life. And we'll see, some of the dead came back to Jung and asked him precisely things of that sort. At the same, all this going on, Jung was in the seances. He also was deeply reading all the literature about spiritualism that was still very popular at the time. Spiritualism starts up in the 1840s, late 1840s, in upstate New York. When the Fox family, some girls in the family started hearing scratches and stuff happening, blah, blah, blah. And it turned out that this was a spirit of someone who had lived in the building before and all that. And then it became this craze. And it swept across the Atlantic. It became very popular here in France and in Russia, all over Europe and all that. And those are the Fox sisters there. And that's that book I mentioned earlier, The Seerist of Prevorst, that is one of the most famous accounts of sort of mediumship in the 19th century. I mean, there's many, many other things. Jung was au fait with all of that. He read all of that back to front and had lectures on it and all this sort of thing. And when he was in his very powerful relationship and meaningful for him with Freud, 1906, 1913, sort of like that, he initially, what he appreciated about Freud was that Freud, he felt independently of himself, of Jung, had come upon actual empirical evidence of an unconscious mind. Jung had found evidence of this himself when he was working as a clinician in the Bergozli Clinic in Zurich, where Freud saw independent. He didn't have much clinical practice, Freud. It was people came to him, to his own consulting rooms. So he mostly got hysterical, neurotic Viennese, and there's quite a few of them at the time then. But Jung started the other way around. He started his psychological work actually working in a clinic. So he was in an asylum, basically. And he had hands-on experience with schizophrenics and psychotics. Because neurotics don't wind up there. They just go to the shrink for 20 years. Psychotics and schizophrenics actually wind up in the asylum. So it's a different sort of, they cut their teeth in different areas of psychology and psychopathology. But Jung was very deeply impressed with Freud. And the famous story is when he first went to visit him in Vienna, they talked with each other for like 13 hours straight or something like that, And it was like, a match made in heaven. But gradually, Jung started to assert his independent views. He could not accept Freud's ideas of the sexual basis of neuroses, basically, the sexual hang-ups that create all of our neurotic problems and all that. And Jung said, yes, by all means, that does happen, but it's not the only cause. And Jung, being brought up in a religious family, had a deep religious sense. He had a deep religious. Freud was not religious. He was Jewish, but his Jewishness, he said, was like his cigar smoking or something. It was like a characteristic of him, but he didn't. It's like, let me tell you, not too many Jews really take it seriously, but this is just how we are. So it's sort of like that kind of thing. Whereas he did, and if you know anything about Freud, like religion and all that, it's just this is just an illusion. We have to get rid of that in some way. So eventually, because Jung was a brilliant man in his own right, he couldn't kowtow to Freud. It took a while, but there's a famous story of the poltergeist in Freud's bookcase, and this was on another visit to Vienna. And that's a picture of the bookcase at the Freud Museum in Hampstead. If you haven't been to it, it's worth going. I went there twice to talk about Jung, so I had to go to Freud's house to talk about Jung. Jungians haven't invited me yet in London, anyway. But the story is, in 1909, at the second visit, they got into an argument about the paranormal, the psychic, about the occult. And Freud was just saying, it's all quatsch, it's nonsense. It's just, it's rubbish, it's junk. And Jung was saying, no, it isn't, my dear sir, it is not. And he kept getting kind of, heated up about it. And he said he felt his diaphragm, that it was glowing. It was glowing red. And then suddenly, there was a bang in the bookcase. And Jung said, see, sir, that was an experience of an exterior catalytic phenomena, which was Jung's, a verbose circumlocution for a poltergeist. And Freud said, it's just not, it's nothing, you're nonsense. No, it was not, and there'll be another one now. And there was. And Jung said Freud was aghast. And I always think his mouth opening up, the cigar falling out. And he looking like Groucho Marx, briefly. At the time, Freud was afraid that Jung made it happen. Jung had the mojo. He had the power. He made it happen. When Jung went back to Zurich, and oi Gewalt, this guy's gone. Freud was able to talk himself out of it and convince him, no, it's old wood and all that. But if you want, that bookcase, it's supposed to be the same bookcase from Freud's place in Vienna, so it's in the Freud Museum up in Hampstead. And I asked them, is that the same bookcase? I said, do you know if the poltergeist is still in there? And we didn't check. So it might, who knows, it might happen. So this was, and that was the beginning of what eventually would become the bust-up, with the breakup, end of the bromance between Jung and Freud. And Jung was powerfully upset by this. He was not only because he had a great love of Freud, and it took him an enormous amount of strength of character and determination to actually, make his own views. It's in his early book, Symbols of Transformation, where it's kind of like somewhere towards the end of the book, he actually says it outright. There's all this other stuff that's really quite Freudian until you get towards the end of the book, and then he basically says, well, the incest, the Oedipal complex, it should not be taken literally. It's a mythological, symbolic narrative of the ego's return to the unconscious in order to be reborn, and so on and so on. So you could, but it was sort of like, when is he going to get to it? We're reading this thing, and eventually, when he got to it, it's like, he was outed. he was outed that he was a mystic and all this kind of stuff. And then everyone in the psychoanalytic world at the time practically turned against him. The one person who was still on his side, strangely enough, was a fellow named Morris Nickel, who we'll get on to him, he was actually practicing on Harley Street here around this time. We'll get on to him. But Jung went through this incredible psychic turmoil. And he tells a story again in Memory, Dreams, Reflections when he was on the train to Schaffenhausen. And he looked out the window and he suddenly saw this huge tidal wave and a huge flood coming from the North Sea. And carnage and blood and wreckage and bodies and all this sort of thing. And he's looking out the train window and this is like the sort of stuff people came to see him about. People were experiencing these sorts of things and they came to see Dr. Jung, and Dr. Jung is like, he's having the same kind of experiences. He doesn't know what it is. And he has similar sort of waking dreams and visions. And then ironically, he's relieved when World War I breaks out. And the guns of August start booming after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in June. Because he realized it wasn't Jung just going out of his mind mad, he was having premonitory visions of the war erupting. And that may have been of some relief to him, but they continued. And just to say, you might think, yeah, okay, that maybe, but he wasn't the only one. There's this German expressionist painter, Ludwig Meidner, who at the same time when Jung was experiencing his own visions, did a series of apocalyptic visions over Europe. And again, predated the outbreak of the war. And there's other things as well. So, it was on the radar. It was on the psychic radar for people who were tuned into it and could pick it up. So Jung was actually relieved that war broke out. But this precipitated, what he called his night sea journey, his descent into the unconscious. The night sea journey is the Nekia from the Odyssey, when Homer goes to the underground. Not Homer, sorry. Ulysses goes to the underground in order to consult the seer Tiresias about how to get back home, basically. And these are the visions that Jung started having. I mean, I don't know if you know the story. This is the stuff that's been, I don't know, when was it published? 2009, 2010, the Red Book. Up until then, it had been secret. No one, Jung kept it in a cubby hole, like a little hole in the kitchen somewhere. And let me show you this. Every now and then he would show some people, but it was never published. Bits and pieces of it were, again, anonymously. Some of the mandalas that are in the Red Book, Jung published in some of his earlier work, but he said they were for patients, even though they were his own, and things of that sort. But Jung says, he felt he was going mad. These visions kept coming to him. He felt like this. Do you want some of this water? That's here. You could. I don't have another glass, but here you could have this. It's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm gonna just...
I've been vaxxed about 15 times, so I think I'm okay.
Me too.
All right, so here we go. Okay, sorry. He starts having these strange waking dreams and waking visions, and he tried to fight it off. He tried to. Oh my God, I'm going mad. He tried to fight it off, but then he eventually said, okay, if I'm going mad, I'll just go mad. Let's see what happens. So he becomes the wounded healer at that point. He allows himself to go mad in the sense of, I won't stop these visions from coming anymore. And this is what takes place in the Red Book. And he has, this all the stories, different narratives. He finds himself dropping into some underground, subterranean realm. It's all gooey and sticky, and there's a river, and then there's like a ruby, and he lifts the ruby up and blood gushes up and all this sort of stuff. You can read about it in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections and in the Red Book. But this is the beginning of this whole period for Jung. It went on for many years. It went on for about 1913, about 6 years. He was in this strange state. At the same time, he kept, he was at the Burgosy. I don't know if he left by then, but he was carrying on a private practice. He was teaching at the Technische Hochschule and things of that sort. And he said to himself, the thing that kept him from totally going mad was that he would say to himself, I'm here, Dr. Jung. I have a wife and I forget how many children at the time. I'm known, so he kept repeating to himself this kind of anchoring in the everyday world. Otherwise, he would have just floated off. But weird things happened. He has a dream where the dove comes to him, and the dove tells him the dove can turn into a girl, but it's only a time when only when the 12 dead are not around. We never quite know who the 12 dead are, but they turn up later on. He has another dream where he's walking through this ancient burial ground in Arles, in France, where these ancient tombs are, and he starts seeing the tombs opening up, and medieval knights and their fingers are like in a Hammer film or something. The fingers are doing things like that, and he's paying attention to the dead, and the dead are coming back to life. The attention he's paying to them is reviving them. And then everyone around him in his family at the time in Küsnacht are having similar visions. His children are talking about people coming into the room at night, whipping their bed clothing off. His son starts talking about visions he's having, and these are similar to the visions Jung is having in his dreams. So there's a whole kind of psychic atmosphere that's happening around, it's like a Stephen King movie or something. Someone should do that, actually. And the upshot of that is one Sunday afternoon, they hear the bell ringer at Küsnacht being rung frantically, and Jung says, "What is this?" And he goes out to the door, nobody's there. But then he hears, "We are the dead. We have come back from Jerusalem, where we did not find what we sought. So we thought we could find it at your house." So the 12 dead turn up at Küsnacht, and they've come from Jerusalem, and they precipitate this channeled work, spiritually dictated work, called the 7 Sermons to the Dead, that Jung took down at this time. And this is the same material that was in the Red Book and later the Black Book and all that. This is a bit, he leaked this bit out a little bit. And it's this, these 7 sermons are written in the city of Alexandria, where the East meeteth the West. The archetypes seem to talketh in that kind of oldest language a lot, and Jung says this somewhere. And thank God they communicate in symbols, I would say, better than hearing that language all the time. It's this kind of, pastiche biblical, kind of talk. And it's this Basilides, who's one of the ancient Gnostic teachers. He's basically the voice communicating the 7 sermons. The 7 sermons have to do fundamentally with what Jung would later call individuation, with the separation from the pleroma, which is the unmanifest one. I guess in Tibetan Buddhism it's the sunyata, or in Kabbalah it's the Ein Sof Er. It's the one for Neoplatonics or Hermeticists. So it's this undifferentiated, unmanifest matrix of and nothing to do with the films, of the world we live in now. And our job is to individuate, to separate from that completely in the sense and become individuals ourselves, to become who we are. This is the theme that Jung, it's just like the central theme of individuation. And earlier than Jung, not too much, but a bit earlier, Nietzsche talked about this as well. Become who you are. You have the potential in you, but you have not actualized it. And so to actually become who you are already, you must make that real in some way. And this is the process of individuation. So make yourself into an individual, to separate yourself from unconscious forces. That, if you don't do that, you're just, a pawn. You're just being used, whether it's the media, whether it's Elon Musk, or the archons. And one person who Jung sent a copy, so this is this privately printed edition of this. And again, Jung was like, should I? He kind of wanted to show it to people, then he didn't want to show it to them. So he was like that a lot. But he sent a copy to Hermann Hesse. And if you know Hesse's novel Damien, that he wrote after World War I, And after his own experience of going extensive analysis, first with Jung and then with the colleagues of Jung, a guy named Joseph Lang, what Jung is talking about in the Seven Sermons of the Dead, Hesse turned into actually a readable sort of Bildungsroman, a novel of education, a novel of growing up, where Emil Sinclair, and it's an interesting story about that because when it was published, Hesse initially published it under the name of the story's protagonist, Emil Sinclair. And it won an award for the best first novel, even though Hesse had written quite a bit before then. It was a lot of money, and Hesse had to admit, well, actually, I've written a bit before then. He gave the money back. But it was such a change from his earlier novels, the style in which he wrote, that no one recognized that this was, and Hesse was a popular novelist at the time, so no one recognized that he was doing it. But if you think, you would think that the 12 dead coming all the way from Jerusalem to knock on Jung's door, actually to pull the ringer at Jung's door, that wouldn't have convinced him, or that wouldn't have been enough to him to actually, this is real. This is real experience. This is something. This is happening. This is from the afterlife coming to him. He had a pretty, bog standard, haunted house experience a couple of years later. So when Jung was a great Anglophile, he loved England. He loved coming here. He used to wear a boater a lot, and kind of those Malacca canes and things like that. He loved the English a great deal, and most of his earliest following came from England as well. Although a lot of the English Jungians are kind of half Freudians. I've discovered this. But he was asked to lecture to the Society of Psychical Research on psychic phenomena. And the lecture, he basically said, well, yes, looking at it strictly scientifically, I see no evidence, compelling evidence for the existence of spirits, but it's the unconscious. It's the unconscious is projecting all these things out into the world and all that. He forgot about the 12 dead, but okay. But oddly enough, that's Morris Nicol, who I mentioned earlier, who actually I did a biography of him recently. It's with my publishers now, so with any luck, it'll come out at some point. He started out as a Jungian Nicol, but then he attended a lecture by P.D. Ouspensky in 1923, and he changed his allegiance. And he became a Gurdjieffian and a Ouspensky, and he went and he spent a year at Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in Fontainebleau, outside of Paris. And he taught the work in England up into the early 50s. And interesting character, Nicol. He went out into Surrey and sort of the home counties, and he set up these kind of off-the-grid communities there, well in advance of many people doing that sort of thing. So, along with his interest in him and being a teacher of the work, he also was sort of alternative life kind of a pioneer. But they were close. Jung considered Nicol his British lieutenant, much as Freud considered Jung, the heir apparent before their breakup. And Jung was actually quite upset when Nicol, jumped ship and went over to Gurdjieff. But for a while, Jung would come over and visit with Nicol, and Nicol had I forget where it was, Aylesbury, I think it was. Yeah, he had a cottage out in Aylesbury, somewhere like that, and it was supposed to be haunted. And that was the story about it. That's why he got it cheap. And Jung went out there and stayed once. And in the middle of the night, he woke up and he saw on the pillow next to him half a woman's face. And there was a horrible smell. And Stephen King kind of noises and things like that happening. And there wasn't any electricity in any place. He got up, lit candles, and spent the rest of the night in an armchair. And hightailed it out of there at the break of dawn. And he saw Morris and Nicol and said, V. Gates, what's happening with this house here, and all this kind of stuff. And Nicol said, well, I told you it was haunted, and all that sort of thing. But then later on, this was like a full-on, pretty standard, I said bog standard haunted house kind of experience, and but Jung's account of it only turned up years later in an obscure anthology of ghost stories, printed only in German. Well, it was in German, but I say it's not been translated into English. And again, there's this hemming and hawing with him because he added a footnote to his original lecture to the Society of Psychic Research, where he said, like, well, there's no evidence for spirits, but it's the unconscious. And he said, well, I'm not quite so sure now, blah, blah, blah. But then he went back again later, another footnote. So if you get the collected works and you look at it, it's kind of like, yes, no, maybe, I'm not sure. But in a letter, he eventually, I think it's one of his colleagues named Fritz Kunkel, someone like that, he says something like, at this point, I believe, metapsychic phenomena can be better understood in terms of the spirit hypothesis. And I have the gun there with that's for two reasons. One is that when Jung was going through his descent to the unconscious, that he really thought he was going mad, he kept a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he thought, if I can't hold on, I'm just going to blow my brains out. This is something that his son, his children lived with at the time. So. But he also tells a story of when he was away lecturing somewhere, I forget where, and he woke up in the middle of the night with this horrible pain in his head. And it turned out that a client of his had sunken into a very deep depression and blew his brains out. And the bullet was, the exact same spot that Jung had felt in his head. So he had this kind of deep, Jung was psychic. He had this incredible deep connection with these sorts of things. But also, that's Richard Wilhelm, who, famous for his translation of the I Ching. And then there's the Carrie F. Bain's translation into the English from Wilhelm's German. And the I Ching is this, fantastic Chinese book of wisdom, but of divination. You probably are familiar with it. Jung was using it as early as the 20s, but he didn't own up that he was using it until later on. He wrote the introduction to Wilhelm's translation. I think it was the late 40s, something like that. But again, I Ching comes out of the Tao and the Yin Yang and all that, and that's the 19th hexagram approach, which is very good. It's very positive. So that's why I put it up there. But Jung, if you know him trying to explain synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence. This is his pseudo-scientific term for meaningful coincidence. It's an acausal connecting principle, which things are connected in a way other than causation. That fell because I picked it up and dropped it, so that's causal right there. But if there was some meaningful relation between things. I did a book recently. Well, it came out last year called Dreaming Ahead of Time. It talks about my own precognitive dreams, but I talk about quite a few synchronicities as well. And I'll give you a brief example of one. I was one time in Camden Town sitting, reading a book about Jung, where Jung was talking about his experience with a client of his coming to him and asking him, basically he wasn't sure whether he should marry this woman or not. And Jung said, well, let's see what the I Ching says about it. So they threw the coins and they got, no, you shouldn't marry. Basically, this is dominant, no, do not marry this woman. I forget, don't pass go. I forget what it is. And I was reading this, I said, gee, I wish Jung was around when I was going through my own marital problems. And as soon as I said that, my ex-wife walked off the bus. So that's the synchronicity, folks. That's the synchronicity. But he's going over about trying to make it a scientific explanation. But in the introduction to this, he says, well, when I've spoken with Chinese scholars about it, they tell me about the spirits, the active, intelligent spirits of the book that provide the answer. And if you use the I Ching, I've been using it for many, many years. And I don't know if you know, there's the hexagram 4, which is called Meng. It's youthful folly. This is the one you get if you ask the same question twice. If you're not happy with the first question, you get this one, and it basically says, the young fool comes to me, I do not go to the young fool, if he is not happy with the first question. And it's like, I don't know if it's my unconscious or spirits, but there's some intelligence at work there. And how does it know? How does a book I bought in 1978 in Santa Monica, in California, and some Chinese coins know that I'm asking it twice? I'll leave you with that. In the 1920s, Jung started construction on Bollingen, which is this medieval castle he built on the shores of Lake Zurich, not far from Kusnacht, his house. And I mean, Jung, you have to say, I mean, he was a lucky guy. He happened to have married, one of the richest women. There she is, Emma, one of the richest women in Switzerland at the time. So, and he had many very well-heeled clients, most of them from America. So in that department, he was doing quite well, and so he was able to afford to be able to build his own castle. And but he called this was sort of, it's called the Tower, but for him it was the Tower of the Dead, because he felt it was a way in which he could honor his ancestors. And the beginning of construction on it started with the death of his mother, and the end of it, the final phase, with the death of his wife, Emma. But it's one of his daughters, I can't remember her name right now, but she said, no, this land, even before all that happened, before he realized that's what he was doing by building the tower, was building a monument to his ancestors and a place where he could commune with them. His daughter said, this place is a place of the dead. And Jung didn't know what she was talking about. But when he was starting on the final construction of it with Emma's death, they unearthed body of the remains, skeleton of a French soldier from the Napoleonic Wars. So she had picked up some of the Preiswerk blood and was able to tell this was happening. So what does this have to do in the broader picture of Jung's psychology here? Well, for Jung, I'm going to go this way because it's too small there. The unconscious corresponds to the mythic land of the dead, the land of the ancestors. If, therefore, one has a fantasy of a soul vanishing, this means that it has withdrawn into the unconscious or into the land of the dead. There it produces a mysterious animation and gives visible form to ancestral traces, the collective contents. Like a medium, it gives the dead a chance to manifest themselves. And the collective unconscious comprises in itself the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. It is the matrix of all conscious psychic occurrences. So, again, he doesn't say reincarnation or immortality or things of that sort. But if you read between the lines, that's basically more or less what he's saying there. And there's Jung in the tower in Bollingen. And there's these stories about whenever he was deep in thought, the pots and pans would rattle, and there would be creaking and all this kind of stuff. And so it was his exteriorized libido was out there pushing things and out there kind of stuff. And no, I'm pretty sure he had it. I think Jung had the mojo. So here we go at the end. And how should we say it? Another very important aspect of Jung's ideas about the dead is our own death. Whereas he talks about death as a goal, not just as an end. And there's a wonderful essays of his, I think it's in Modern Man in Search of His Soul, called The Stages of Life. And he talks about, there's the morning, the noon, afternoon, and then the evening. And basically he says the work of individuation, the work of becoming who you are, doesn't really happen until the midlife crisis. So perhaps he's projecting his own experience, because that's when he went through his breakup with Freud. He was in his late 30s. And the midlife crisis is usually 30, 40, was it Dante? Midway through life's, whatever, I found myself on the dark path. So that, back then, midway, I don't know, in Dante's time, midway could have been 10, I don't know. But, it's this 35, 40 into there. You've established yourself in the world. You've found a place, you've had a family, you've reproduced yourself in some way. Now you can look at life in the sense, what's the meaning of all this? What's this all about? I no longer have to push and fulfill, the sort of necessary getting and spending sort of thing. I can devote myself to the inner world. And this is something that's part of Hindu tradition already, Indian tradition, where the Hindu, after doing all the things, establishing his world, making a career, having children, a family, they if they choose, they can go off to the ashram and just focus on their inner world then. So Jung is talking about that. about how in our own lives, not so much the dead and the afterworld, but our own ideas about death. Are we desperately clinging on to youth? I know I do a heck of a lot of the time, but you know. Do we have some positive idea of the sunset years? That's what I intend to read Balzac, or get back to Proust, or something like that. We say rather than do not go gentle into that good night. Go kicking and screaming like Dylan Thomas. Jung is saying no. We should in some way understand our own life as a process. And the goals of the evening, the goals of the sunset cannot be the same goals as those of the dawn, in that sort of way. So this is one of the big differences in a very general way between Freud and Jung. Because Freud basically is your childhood. You're screwed after that. That's it. Everything of any importance happened to you before you were 5. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except spend a lot of money at a Freudian psychologist and talk to him about it for a long time. Jung is like, yeah, that's right, but forget about what's ahead. Don't think about the dream as being caused by something. Think about the dream as trying to tell you, get a load of that. Pay attention to that. It has a teleological aspect rather than a causal one. It's heading towards a goal rather than being pushed by something behind it. So our own lives are like that. Jung is one of the early ones to talk about adult development. Most psychologists don't talk about adult development because what development? That's it. Once you've reached reproductive age and you've done that, that's it. Nature doesn't need you anymore. Sorry, whoever has the most toys, right? Isn't that basically the idea at the end when the fat lady sings and all that kind of thing? But Jung's talking about actually there's a goal. It's goal-oriented in the sense of have a fulfilled life in some way. And especially now, when life expectancy is longer than it was at Freud or Jung's time, we've got a heck of a lot more time on our hand, and more people have that time. What are you going to do? They find some creative way to do that. As I mentioned, Marie-Louise von Franz, there's this quote about his father, the dream of his father convincing him that there was an afterlife. But there's a wonderful book by Marie-Louise von Franz on dreams and death. It's incredibly overpriced on Amazon, and that's a collection of excerpts from different works of Jung on death and immortality. But on that note, thank you very much.